Welcome, welcome, welcome. So today is Chess Ideas You Must Know. I was sort of torn between, I didn't know what I wanted to talk about today, but I do have faith in the chat that most of you would know which side you would rather be in this position. My goal was not to really show you this position to play it out, but my goal is really to just use this as an introduction to the position that we're going to the positions that we're going to be looking at today. So, number one, if you look at this position, what are some of the first things? What are some of the first things that you notice about this position? Because I think some of the features within the position are more important than the actual moves themselves. So, Sir Bruce says 2-on-1 on the queen side, and the king is there to assist. So that's very good. The doubled pawns, Joan says, okay, in a way, I like French expert's contribution. He says ineffective majority for black pieces. I agree with that. White gets the first pass pawn. I agree with that notion as well. Expanded cranium. I like where you guys are. I like where you guys are going with this. So, well, basically, guys, all of that is correct. Okay. So in this particular situation, there are a few things to take into consideration. So number one is this effective pawn majority that white has on the queen side. So we have a 2-on-1, so that's queen side majority for white. We have a 4-on-3, which seems like a reasonable majority, but there's one problem. You cannot use this majority to create a pass pawn unless white does you a favor, like white blunders. But, and we'll look at that for just a second. I like talking about this. It's not really a brain teaser. It's just to help you better understand pawn structure in chess and pawn endgames. So, and then we're going to get to some games, some game fragments, and maybe some complete games depending on how the night goes. But, well, basically the idea is that black's majority of pawns, because the f-pawns are double, is called a crippled majority. So that is where you have a majority of pawns, but you cannot produce a pass pawn. And one of the principal things in the endgame, to be able to do in the endgame, is create a pass pawn. That's what the big fight in every chess game in the endgame is, who gets that dangerous pass pawn. Sometimes when there are pieces on the board, the pieces fight against pawns becoming passed or deal with pass pawns. And then in the king and pawn endgame, the one thing you're fighting for is the creation of a pass pawn and basically who queens their pawns. Okay, so that's a huge part of the endgame is based around the pass pawn. Okay, so one thing I would like for you guys to have noticed in this position is that it is the following. So a healthy majority for white, meaning that white's 2-on-1 here on the queen side can easily produce a pass pawn. Black has a 4-on-3, cannot produce a pass pawn without white's mistake. For example, if black goes g4, white just doesn't move on the king side. He leaves the pawns exactly where they are, and there's no way that black produces a pass pawn. If you can imagine a situation where I say, you have these pawns, I have these pawns, your king cannot infiltrate, use those to create a pass pawn without a white error, you can't do it. Your best chance is to go g4 and hope that white captures and undoubles your pawns so that you can create a pass pawn. But if white does not do that, and white should not do that, then this is not a good sign for the black pieces. Okay, I know that French expert doesn't like to listen. He likes to listen to himself instead. But I said that you cannot use the kings. Okay? So the point is that even if I let you play the moves with black, without your king, your pawns alone cannot produce a passed pawn. That's a problem. Because here's the thing. This king could be over here, right? And you can't do anything about creating a passed pawn here. While for white, white just goes here and has a runaway pawn. It's easy for white. White, there's nothing black can do to stop white about creating this passed pawn. Okay, now this is not the basis of what I want to show you today. I've got some games to show you. I've got all sorts of things to show you. But I want to make sure that we're on the same page about what's important in the endgame phase. So, number one is one's ability to create a passed pawn. And as mentioned earlier, the passed pawn is very important because even if it's not a king and pawn endgame, even if there are other pieces on the board, a lot of times you have to commit those other pieces into stopping a passed pawn, right? So the person who does that first, who creates a dangerous future queen first, has the advantage. In a king and pawn endgame, that's what it's all about. Number two that I want you to remember about endgames. The smaller your army, the more your pieces have to do. Okay? Including your king. So, I guess if I were to make some sort of analogy, I would say that you're doing a project at work or a project in school, and there's a team of you. Let's say there's a team of 10 of you. Arbitrary. Doesn't really matter. And if it's 10 and one person isn't doing something, but the other 9 are, you can still successfully carry out that project. Now, take a situation where you have 2 people in a team and you have to carry out a project, and one of them is not doing their work. Well, then your success rate is going to be a lot lower because it's just the larger your army, the more screw ups you can have. The smaller your army, everyone's got to be doing everything. So it's just really important. That's another important tip in the endgame is you'll often see the strongest players in the world sacrificing material to activate their pieces. Let's say I sacrifice 1 pawn to liberate my rook and get all active on you. So you see a lot of people do that. Okay? So activity in the endgame, very important. Smaller your army, the more you've got to do. Okay? So those are some tips for you, and obviously you got to use your king. Use that king in the endgame too. Don't be afraid to use that king then. Okay, so this was just the introduction to what we're going to talk about. Let's start with the following position. Okay, if you will. So we're starting here, and I can flip it if you prefer. So we can see here that the end game here is Paul Morphy versus Napoleon Marat, and we have this the following situation here. And I'm a little curious what people think about this position and what may be the main factor here. And things are going to get a little bit harder this evening, but I would say that my main focus is the pawn endgame. So number one is first assess the position, and then we'll talk about what's supposed to happen. And again, we're starting easy. We're going to get to some deeper examples in just a moment. Okay. So the key for me is that my audience is able to identify the basic but small things in the position and to be able to notice them just looking at it. It doesn't matter whose move it is. I just explained that to you. Please listen. Be a good student. It's not about whose move it is. It doesn't matter. I want to know what the characteristics are within the position first. So you look at it and then you go and you're trying to figure out what's happening. The first thing you got to look at is what's happening with the pawns. So Hopkins says, I noticed that black's pawns are further advanced. Okay, that's an observation. What else? White's pawn structure isn't very good, thanks to this distant pawn that's separated from its peers. Black's connected passers look very juicy. White can never... I like Who's Your Daddy right here. I like Who's Your Daddy says that the pawn on c5 can never be taken by White's king because that would make this pawn a passed pawn. I think that's very, very, very important. Okay? Exactly. So, number one thing that I wanted you to notice in this position is that the two connected passed pawns are extremely effective because the white king will never be able to get active because, number one, it has to guard these two pawns, and number two, it can't ever attack and remove them because the moment that this pawn is captured, this pawn promotes. The king is too far behind. So that's number one, which is by far the most important thing. This king will never be active in this game because it will always have to babysit these pawns, and there's no way around it. You can activate your king all you want, but you still can't capture this pawn, so basically white is a sitting duck. I mean, the question is whether or not white can really hold the situation together with these weak pawns. At the present time, white does not have a passed pawn. White has a majority, 3-on-1, which is really good normally, but there is no passed pawn, and that's the issue. Okay, so there's nothing keeping black tied down at the moment. So, of course, Morphy shows great understanding, but also it's very logical what he did. He brought the king up. White brought the king up. He improves. And again, it's a waste of time to go after this pawn because you can't capture it anyway. Then this pawn promotes. So he tries to connect his pawns, but the problem is that the king infiltrates. The king is way too close. And there was nothing to really do about this. For example, if you push first, the king still comes up. You're just not close enough. And it's just a sad day in the neighborhood for white because he had to have thought about this before he reached this endgame. And so I don't want to get too deep on my chat here, but basically what I'm trying to show you is what to avoid earlier in the game so that you don't wind up in one of these situations. Okay, because a lot of times what happens is people come into these positions, and again, I sort of know my audience by now, so you sort of think about it when it's too late, right? You get into the position and you think about it too late. I'll tell you a little story. I wish I had the game. I played, let me see, where did I play him? I think it was at Land of the Sky, which was at some point one of the largest open tournament in North Carolina, in Asheville, North Carolina. But it's since been surpassed by other tournaments, but for years and years and years. And it was one of the tournaments I always went to when I was coming up. And I got a chance to play Nikola Mitkov, I think Grandmaster Nikola Mitkov. And we got into an endgame. It was a Steinitz French. I was black. I had a perfectly great position. And there was an endgame. And I traded queens, and it was an even pawns endgame, and I was like expert at that time, like 2000, maybe 2050. And this was where I would say I was a little bit naive at that time. I had not played a lot of stronger players than me. I was just sort of whipping up on, people like McCartney and stuff like that. Okay, so I didn't really have a great chance to play a lot of strong players. And so all the psychological things I didn't know, like strong players never really want to trade with you unless they think it's better for them and so forth. Like I wasn't really thinking that way. So I got into an even pawn endgame, and it was a forced loss, even though it was like even, and I didn't really think much about it. And it was just like, it was a king and pawn endgame, equal pawns, no pawn structure damage, but his pawn majority got going faster, and like something like this happened. It wasn't the same thing, but something like this happened. And I lost, and I remember that, and I don't remember the whole game, but it was something like this. And the key for me was the learning experience wasn't that the endgame was losing, more than I needed to foresee that before I went into the endgame. It was too late by the time I traded off my remaining pieces. And identifying these types of characteristics before you trade your pieces is the important part. Don't wind up here and go, material even, I'm going to draw. Don't do that. That's what I did. You don't want to be like me. Don't do what I did. As my father used to say, I don't want you to be like me. I want you to be better than me. Okay? So listen to his words, and that's the key. Okay? So white is totally busted here, and the reason for that is because black already has passed pawns, and you can't harass them in any way. And so the black king is also active, so it didn't take much here after what the game played out like this. Basically, white was never able to produce that passed pawn, and he tried, but Morphy stopped it, and the game ends. I like this little deflection of the king, finally cashing in on those pawns, and he easily wins the pawn endgame here. I find it a little weird that you didn't go here. I don't know if the notation is completely, if it's wrong or something. It is from 150 years ago, maybe even more. But you would just go here, and then there's no way this king catches you because you're shouldering the king out. You're just blocking the king out. We do have a question. What about h4 instead of h4? F4? So right here, king d3, king g6, and then f4. What if I go here? Does this change much? It doesn't look like it. No king move. So f4, king g6, and then what? Then h4. This is an interesting one. Yes. This would have been a good one. But can anyone after this find the issue? Nicholas Della Colina says g6. And yep, that wins. It stops the pawns in their track so that there's no passed pawn, and the king comes into f5. Very good. Awesome. But I agree with French expert that it was probably a better try than what Napoleon played. g6 is important because the king, after f4, the king can come this way while g6 stops the h-pawn from producing the passed pawn. So that's a very good one, McCartney. Yeah, so king f7, h4, king g6, f4. I got you. But in the game, Napoleon played king to d3. Which is why king g6 was played, and that wins. But I agree. If h4 or f4 was played, then g6 first, and then yes, then the king comes up. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, this was a real game, and you guys are gonna get pawn endgames like this when you play even with your opponents. And I mean, I had some of the craziest endgames that were never supposed to be endgames, by the way. Like, I played so many games where I screwed up so much in the middle game that it became an endgame. Yeah, that's the problem. Okay, it's you don't necessarily want them, but sometimes you get them because you don't know how to put people away in the middle game. So, welcome, Lafong, welcome. So, yeah, so I remember actually at Lafong's tournament, I was playing Mark Plotkin, and it was a very crazy middle game, and up and down, and in the end, when the smoke cleared after many errors from both of us, as you know, as normal, and it was it ended in an end game, bishop and rook versus rook, and after a very topsy-turvy game. And so sometimes you don't look for it, but mistakes, inaccuracies in the middle game lead to it. So get used to it. You're going to get endgames even if you're not looking for them. Okay? All right, what about this one, guys? This is a I love this one. And what I will tell you is that on this stream, because I know who my audience is, I don't show endgame studies. That's number one. I always show real games, fragments from real games, the way real games played out, maybe what we could do better, but I show you real games. And the reason for that is endgame studies have a place in chess, but I don't really think they're made for lectures. Yeah. So okay. Well, this is a game, a real game. Mikhail Tal was playing the white pieces versus this guy Jurasevich. Okay, Jurasevich. And well, here's the thing. I want you to take a look at the situation, the position, and I want you to try to understand who should be preferred here, or if anyone should be preferred, or maybe you think that the position is equal, which it would be a perfectly acceptable thing to think, by the way. So, let me help you out. So, one characteristic that I see is that each side has their own majority of pawns. So, 3 against 2 on the queen side for Mikhail Tal, and Jurasevich has 4 versus 3. So, another thing that I would notice is that each side has a pawn majority. That's very important. Okay? So, each side has a pawn majority. The kings are equally active. And, however, it's a matter of who outwits the other with their pawn pushes to see who gets the passed pawn first. Well, let me tell you, so you're not beating your head against the table here about whose move it is, because everyone wants to know whose move it is. The position is a draw with best play. Okay? Position is a draw. It's white to move, but the position is a draw, even with white to move. Okay? But here's the thing. The game did not end in a draw because it's harder to play one side than the other. Whose side is it harder to play? It's definitely harder to play black. It's definitely harder to play black because it takes longer to produce an effective passed pawn. Black could try to produce a passed pawn down the center, but then what's your problem? Thank you for the subscription, M-Psych. So black can produce the e-pawn as a passed pawn, but there's an issue with that. So like I can produce a passed pawn over here several different ways. All of them sort of start with c4. But f6 and e5 is the fastest way for black to create a passed pawn, but there's a big problem. So white's king is ready to stop that pawn, and something very important otherwise. Yeah, the outside passed pawn is a serious thing in chess. So when you produce a passed pawn further away from the king, that means that this king has to go running after it. This king is well placed in the center. And sometimes, even if the king ends up winning a pawn over here, this king's going ham on the other side of the board. Okay? So, well, the key thing to know about these positions, whether they're a draw or not, is one, when you get into this position in your own game, you don't really care so much about what the computer says that the decision is. You got to think about it with some strategy. So you're like, okay, I need to get my majority going. So pawn to c4, as many of you had suggested. Pawn to c4. Very good. Pawn takes, king takes. And here, Jurasevich made a really not a good move. And it immediately kills his chances to hold this position. I don't want to tell you what it is, but he really did himself in here. Number one, though, no matter what, is whatever move you choose, you better get your majority of pawns rocking and rolling. Because if you don't do that, you're definitely going to lose. See, like, if you try to go here and stop the passed pawn from being created, you're not actually going to stop it. That's the thing. You're not stopping the passed pawn by moving your king over. So basically, you have to start to mobilize your majority of pawns too. The question is, well, basically, how do you do it? That's the hard part. So I'll tell you what was played in the game, and I don't want you to ever do this in your own game. Okay? Here. Ready? What's up, guys? What's up? So, I don't ever want you to play this in your own game. Really bad move by Jurasevich, which is surprising that he played this move. Because up to this point, he's played Tal evenly. Can anyone explain in words what the problem with e5 is? It's a huge problem. e5 was like the worst move on the board, sadly. So Pope Benedict says, it brings the king too far away from the queenside passer. That's true. It does bring the king further away. What else? I think French expert had said that 3-on-2 is harder to produce a passed pawn, which is very accurate. Especially these three, all the way back here. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, Della Colina. Yeah, exactly. It's harder to create a passed pawn with those pawns back there. And so let's watch what happens, right? Saying that this is a mistake, let's watch what happens. And then what I want you guys to do is think about, like, on this move, what it was that black should have played, And maybe there are many answers, but there's one answer that I like a lot here to produce his own passed pawns. But we're going to get to that in just a second. But e5, bad move, because let's look at this position right here. All right, let's look at this. These 3 pawns, let's just count the time it takes for black to produce a passed pawn with no moves by white, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That produces the passed pawn. And then, on top of that, the king stops that passed pawn because he's within the square. So you would need another king move to block the white king out. So let's think about that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just to produce your passed pawn safely. Okay? So, well, French expert, you're not really making any sense. So, you mean to tell me when white is doing this, you're going to spend 800 moves going to capture this pawn so that your pawns are the furthest possible away, furthest possible place from queening. Is that what you're suggesting? Okay, because I'm trying to understand everyone's thought right here, and I don't take it easy on French expert because he's a good chess player. That's why. Normally, I take it easy on people, but he's an expert chess player, so I'm not going to let him slide on that. So, okay. So, the fastest way for black to create a passed pawn is this one. Realistically. But that takes forever. So I love what Tal does here. He starts to create his own. b4. I like this a lot. Pawn to f5. We talked about this. And now Tal calculated it perfectly. Tal calculated it perfectly. He decides, I want the passed pawn to be furthest away from this king. And he calculated something very brilliant. Remember how we talked about something here. When black goes here, 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 he also needs this king to shoulder out the other king. Which means, let me try to simplify because I know that's a lot of thinking. Which means that when this happens, the king needs to be here, or else this king comes back and eats up the pawn. Well, if the king has to be here, Tal wants to promote on a8. Because when he promotes, it'll be checked. So Tal played b5, which is really a fantastic move. And incredible calculation. Due to the following line of play, which is what happened in the game. So, okay, you have to take that. Now, it looks like the king has been drawn so far away from the battle that he loses. But this outside passed pawn is going to prove immensely difficult for black to stop. Black's only hope is to create a passed pawn of his own, as we discussed, because he cannot stop this one. So he goes. Both sides. Here we go, right? All is well. And now this is the key nail in the coffin. How do you force black to have to go here? Pope Benedict, very good. Awesome. Awesome. Yep. And I drew some little graphics for you there. I'll erase them so you're not confused. But basically, the white king is in the square, which means that the white king stops the pawn if it tries to promote without the assistance of the king. So, for example, here, as mentioned, This king stops the pawn, and good luck chasing this one down if you're black. So the logical move is king here, shouldering out the white king, but as Tal brilliantly calculated, this pawn promotes with check. For example, check, and he wins. And he could do it a lot of different ways, but okay. So, see you guys. Yep. So, this was, well, basically a combination of so many endgame principles. And Jurasevich did himself in when he played the move pawn to e5. And sadly for him, after this, he's lost in a million different ways, including the move king to c5, by the way. Just going down the board, okay? But Tal didn't want to get into that type of pawn race, so he used his pawns to create the passer, and all he calculated, the principal move in this whole calculation was the move king to c4, which is actually beautiful. You have to play here, or else my king stops this pawn. And when you play there, I promote with check. Well, here's what I can tell you, and we're going to go back to this moment. If black plays f3, yeah, takes, and king to d3. Yeah. This illustrates, if we go on this pattern, this illustrates why the outside pass pawn is very important. So, like, for example, let's keep playing this out. So, like, you're going to get this. But your king, chasing down the outside pass pawn, now loses the game because you're in Nantucket and this pawn is just rolling down the board. You can't stop it because you're over there. So that illustrates, I mean, they avoided that line of play, but that illustrates why having the outside passer is more powerful, because you got to go chasing it on the outside, which puts you further away from the action. Yeah. So, objectively speaking, the endgame was a draw, but not after the move e5. After the move e5, the white wins by force. And so it was just important that he didn't do that. So if we could have this position back, right? And we were playing black here, and we're trying to save the game and not lose it, like what happened. E5 was horrific, though. I feel like you just can't play this way. Brian Frame, thank you for the subscription. So we're on our way to 250 subs. I never thought, but thank you. And so many followers and everything, greatly appreciated. So Lazy says, do you have time to calculate, or are there some patterns that can aid your recognition? Well, there are patterns, Lazy, because here's the thing. E5, you're cashing in one of your pawns, which is a candidate pass pawn, right? And you're putting yourself further away from creating a pass pawn. So your intuition should tell you not to play the move pawn to e5. So that's number one. You're putting yourself, and you're drawing your king away from these pass pawns, so that you don't even have any hope to try to catch them anymore. So at e5 is just wrong for so many reasons, even without calculation. Okay? There's so many moves to pick from, you should not settle on e5. You should choose something else. King c6, g5. g5 is the correct move. I analyzed this with my students. This is correct. Surprisingly, I analyzed it with them without computers, and then we checked it with computers, and it draws. And there was a very important detail that I would like to point out. Yeah, I'd like to point out about this position. At first, I didn't like this. I didn't like this because after trade, I was actually concerned that there would be an outside pass pawn for white, which would develop, not like this, by the way, which might even lose for white after the move pawn to g4, stopping this push by en passant. But first, h3, and then here. But to my great surprise, my students were winning with black in this line. And I was like, that's crazy. I was like, they must not be playing it right. So I sat down and played some of my students. They were like 15, 1600 maybe. And I was having trouble with white here. Because black has these passed pawns now. Right? And I was like, oh, right? Because here, for example, and here, I kept losing here with white. Because this, right? So I was like, these little 1600s can't beat me, right? So they played for like an hour with the position, and eventually the idea of g5 started to dawn on me a little bit. Like, okay, so g5, very important move because it fractures the white king side, and the most direct way for white to play is takes, h3, g3, and h4 to produce two separate passed pawns. Does not work. It just doesn't work. So after some experimentation, I was like, dang, g5 is pretty good. Because if you can't do that, right, then your pawn structure gets fractured. And then black creates an outside pawn of his own with e5. Now e5 is good because there's no, if you take, you have a passed pawn. That's the key. White doesn't even have a passed pawn yet. The game is a draw here, but white has to work maybe a little bit. White has to still produce their passed pawn. So g5 is the best. I could not figure it out. But we figured it out by playing it out. Because there's this book by Mikhail Tal, who is my grand coach, and it's his best games. And to my surprise, a lot of the games were endgames, right? And, you know, I mean, well, it's better to play them out, basically. Unless says, what about f6 and e5? I sort of talked about this. I didn't like the move f6. This didn't work out in practice either, because you're producing an isolated passed pawn that's very close to white's king, right? So I'm trying to remember. I think at first we started with this, but then we realized that black could play g5 and get back into a similar line. So we were playing, I think it was h4. And well, the basic idea, Unlesser, is that after this, this pawn is easy for white to catch, and we have a situation where white's going to have an outside passed pawn, which black is going to have to chase after. White's going to get this and then be closer to the pawns on the king side. For example, like, let me play it out a little bit. Let's say here, and I mean, I'm basically just trying to illustrate the problem with having this as a pass pawn here. So the pawn furthest away from the center is the most valuable in these types of situations, because look where it puts the enemy king, right? And then white's ready to come up and mop these out. It's sort of the case of the outside pass pawn. So that's why I didn't like f6 in e5. I didn't like that plan. But you have to see the g5 idea. So I remember, and this is hard to do if you're not part of like a chess club and stuff, because basically, well, here's the thing. It's best to play these positions out without, like, it's good to know what the, let's say, objective evaluation is. Like, maybe you put it in the computer, it says 0.00, but don't look at the lines. Just sort of look at, like, try to play it out with a partner or with a group of people and see what you come up with. That's good for training. That's what they do in the European academies, right? You play from a position, right? And you play it out. It's not just solving puzzles, but it's actually playing out positions that might be equal. But, you know, you like, I think I lost the position like 5 times before I drew it. You know? So I was like, no wonder this Jurasevich. But here's the thing. My beef with Jurasevich is that he played the worst move possible, right? He played e5. That move appalls me because it puts him at a huge disadvantage when it's time to march his pawns forward. He's so far behind white. So, yeah, I don't know. In a blitz game, I mean, this is like, any pawn endgame in a blitz game is like ridiculous, you know? But in a real game, it's the small things that count. So, okay. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let's look at another situation. So, okay. Let me get to... I don't really want to start with this. Okay. I want us to begin here. So, this is a brilliant endgame, which combines a couple of things. The use of the majority. By the way, I should say that white is actually up a pawn here. So I think it's important to point that out. But black thought that they could hold the situation together because, well, it's hard to have something going on over here. And there's a crippled pawn majority here. So there's no real way for either side. So watch what happens. Okay? This is what Capablanca allowed. He allowed his protected pass pawn. Now, my question to you is, like, let's progress a few moves. Is it possible for white to win this position? Objectively, meaning with best play. Just take a second to try to look at its features. Like, let's look at the basic things first. So you've got this this 4-on-3 here, but the issue is that if you just go with h4, g5, right? You may not actually be able to win because black's king will be over here to get this pawn. So let me try to show you what I mean. So king to d6, h4, king back to e7, g5. So I'm here, you know, I'm not exactly even sure what to play here. like this looks not great if you just do this. So I actually like this a lot. This approach. I'm trying to figure out. I wonder what Black was going to play if Capablanca did this. Because this looks like a very direct approach. I think he was going to do this. Probably. Yeah, okay, but this looks like it wins. Okay. But there's another idea that I think... What's this? Who said it? Nanuka said it. And Candy B just said it as well. I know this is great, but the reason I like to show this game is this is a legitimate pawn break. Yep. And that's a difficult one. Because if this is played, you give Black pass pawns, but you get one of your own. Thank you, Dean, for 500 bits. Greatly appreciated, of course, as always. Remember that my lecture ends in 4 minutes, but you can buy my soul if you'd like me to continue. But sometimes everyone's having a bad day, they don't want to contribute to the channel, so I just stop at my hour. But remember, you can buy me out, as Dean and Galactic are trying to do. Okay. So, Capablanca played like a genius here. What, very interesting though. Okay, so he plays this. So he brings the king to the middle. That's not like a genius. Okay, that's like normal right now. And after King D6, he begins to push forward on the king side, expanding his majority on that wing. So Black keeps going back. And finally, Capablanca carried through his idea, which is now to create pass pawns on both wings. He wants a pass pawn over here, and he's going to get one over here. So what did he do? Yep. Exclam B5, B4. Which is aesthetically a really nice move. Exclam. Yep. So, well, the problem going into this endgame for Black, of course, was that, well, he's down a pawn. So don't be down a pawn. If you want to not lose chess games, don't be down a pawn. The other issue is that this move is just really brilliant because it produces a pass pawn no matter what. So his opponent took. Here's this pass pawn. Come over here and stop this one so I can come over here. And the game ended as follows, where basically you're giving Black 2 pass pawns, but you're close enough with your king to stop them both. So here comes the king back to assist. There's your second pass pawn. Your poor king is like a three-legged chicken here, you know, trying to stop these pawns. It's impossible. And, well, you know, Black was down a pawn in that game, but basically similar things could happen in a game where pawns are even. What I want you to take away from this as far as a winning strategy for White went was production of 2 pass pawns, even if that means giving away a little bit. So for my more beginner viewers, I would imagine that when you're thinking about this endgame, you probably took it out of your brain that the move b4 was even possible. It probably, you wiped it out of your brain completely from future candidate moves because you just don't see that ever working out. To my more advanced listeners, like Hans Niemann, who's in the chat, and others who I don't know, but who are advanced and very experienced, you know that stuff like this happens all the time. Pawn breaks should never be disregarded, even when they look like they're not possible. In fact, some of the strongest pawn breaks occur in positions where they're pinched by 2 pawns. Okay? So, b4, if c takes, yes, this is even easier because after takes, then you push. And you still have 2 passed pawns. The king easily stops this. Right? So let's say here's our second passed pawn, and again, a passed pawn on the g and a passed pawn on the c, this king can't guard them both. It's just not one of those gigs. So, well, that's the thing, right? The move b4 produces that very necessary second passed pawn. It's possible he could have won without it, but Unlesser is being honest, and he says b4 is so unnatural and it's difficult to calculate for me. Yeah, so I don't think it's actually not much calculation, but you have to make sure that you don't wipe it out of your candidate moves, which are moves that you're thinking about. So you might look at this and say it's hard calculation, but it's not that hard. You just have to see that this move is possible and understand the purpose is to create a passed pawn. There actually isn't a lot of calculation. It's more of a strategic concept, which is create 2 passed pawns. So I would say that the difficult part for you is making sure that this move doesn't escape your list of candidate moves, realizing that pawn break yields a passed pawn one way or the other.